Great. Thanks very much. And thank you to UBC and everyone that's helping to host this webinar. It's an honor to be invited to present. And I think we're going to kick off with a question that really was one of the main impetus for us embarking on this journey of trying to figure out what was happening with education privatization in the world, and in particular in Chile. And in 2011, education protests erupted in Chile in a social movement involving hundreds of thousands of people. And, you know, those of us in education know that kind of attention isn't usually given to our subject. And it's important to note and to study why that happened and what's going on. So what we have done is written a book called Global Education Reform, and it's edited by myself, Björn, and Linda Darling-Hammond, who's also the faculty director of the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy and Education. In this book, briefly, we look at 6 different countries, and we'll discuss that a bit in detail. But the other authors are, for Chile, Abelardo Castro and Lilian Gomez. For Cuba, Martin Carnoy at Stanford has written the Cuba chapter. For Sweden, Björn wrote the Swedish chapter. Pasi Sahlberg wrote the Finnish chapter. Myself and Linda wrote the U.S. chapter. And then Michael Fullen and Santiago Rincon Gallardo wrote the Canadian chapter that focuses on Ontario. So our book is coming out in early March. It will be out at the Comparative International Education Society meeting in Vancouver, actually.
Nice.
So the impetus for this book is really look historically at what were the root causes that led to this social movement. When we look back in Chile, we see that in the 1970s and 80s, Pinochet, who's actually in this photo with Milton Friedman, Pinochet is on the right of the photo and Milton Friedman's in the center, decided to implement a voucher program in Chile. And the voucher program over the past 30 years has really created a system that's increased inequity in Chile to the point where teachers, educators, students went into the streets in protest.
Right.
And we're going to contrast this with Finland. And really this book, in my mind, came from an article, an imaginary article I had in my head called The Future of U.S. Education, Finland or Chile. It's really outlining these 2 different approaches to education that started a generation ago. And basically, Finland was moving out of the Soviet model, deciding how to organize their education system, and they decided to focus on equity in education. And when we fast forward 30 years, the results, shocking to everybody in the international community, was that Finland ended up with some of the top scores internationally over time consistently on assessments such as PISA. And here we can see that while they ranked 4th on 2000 on math, they have been consistently in the top 3 in every other year in every other category, and that trend has continued in the last decade as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Björn here to talk a little bit about our country selection.
Yeah. So I believe when you have been listening to Frank, you have understood that this is a particular kind of research, piece of research we have here. It's kind of an historical analysis where we look back and try to understand the development in those countries and to see in details more about their school system and how they operate and the rationale in between. So we choose to study a set of pairs that displayed different models and trajectories with particular different rationales. They were sort of working along different logics, and they, what we understood, also deliver different outcomes. So if we go through this, in Scandinavia, we found Sweden and Finland displaying different options. Similar partly in history, but then goes in different directions. We look in North America, then of course there is this problem with Canada and United States as sort of the differences with like countries like Sweden and Finland, who has national policies in education of a particular kind. So in Canada we look into Ontario, and in the United States it's two other examples that it is. And then in Latin America we decided to choose, as Frank indicated, Chile was the natural choice, and the second we picked there was Cuba, with a very special sort of history of being set outside the not that open to through the blockade and so on. So we chose this kind of pairs that on an overarching level represented different models, what we label a public investment model and a privatization model.
Yeah, that's good.
So if we then look into outcomes, if we take that approach, so we can start here. Qualification in terms of PISA score is essential, and I will just show you some graphs here, and many of you are familiar with the development. So if we take this example, mathematics literacy score, you have on the first line here you have the OECD mean, and then the green one here is Finland, which has been constantly above average and the top performing country. Sweden has another trajectory that nowadays it has been on a slippery slope, so to say, since the year 2000, and so Sweden is now below average and are struggling with their educational system. Canada represents another top level performance country, and if we compare that with US, you can see another development. And if we look into Chile, we haven't full data here from Chile, but we have an indication here. And if we change into another set of data, we can relate Chile and Cuba to the other countries we study. So we use here another set of data which shows the percent of students at highest proficiency level in 2005 and 2006. And here you can see 6th grade and 3rd grade, and you have math and reading. So if we bring in data from Chile, and if we bring in Cuba, we can have an idea of the relationship between those, the outcome from those educational systems. So we sort of have that in mind in our when we took a look at this. So we wanted to select pairs that were they had different educational models, they had struggled with their history in different sense, and it seemed that we had indication that they produced different types of outcome. So if we look back then on this sort of overview of what we do, I can say that here we could display both. It sort of informs us about the it could serve as an introduction to the book, but it also sort of says something about the development, and I will take you shortly through this. As Frank talked about initially here, we sort of take Chile and the development in Chile as a kind of a starting point. And as you all know, that's the history about the coup and the desire that Pinochet took to overhaul society, including the school system. While they also then introduced this voucher system that we sort of can see as a cause to the conflicts in nowadays. We can also look here into the 1990s, where US launched in the Milwaukee voucher program, and at the same time we had a change in Sweden. Sweden quite abruptly made a significant change in its school system and introduced a market model that in a very few years in significant ways substantially changed the school system in Sweden. And so here we have Chile, US, and Sweden, who sort of have a particular approach to this global education reform movement. And I forgot to mention the later development also in United States with the charter school movement, which is extremely important in this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I will now take another approach and say something about the other three studies in this book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Finland and Sweden had quite similar educational system historically.
Mm-hmm.
Sweden took this turn into this new model in the early 1990s, and Finland, the years after, Finland was looking towards Sweden, and they were thinking that we need to modernize our old system because Sweden has chosen another model that seems much more modern. We need to follow their example. So they had prepared to follow that model. But when the plans were on the table, the first PISA results came about, and they realized that the outcome from their school system was really, really strong. So those plans went into the wastebasket, and we speak about this as Finland sort of ended up with a kind of immunity to this global educational reform movement, because they realized that the system they had built was producing high quality education. Canada is another story, as you might know. In Ontario, they took a turn in the 1990s, establishing an increased emphasis on privatization in education and different other changes, which created also some turmoil. And after the elections, I believe it was in 2003, they changed approach again, started to rebuild a stronger educational system, a lot of capacity building. They focused on the whole child pedagogy, and they have gained very good results. Lastly, Cuba is interesting because Cuba, their kind of is isolation. They never sort of brought in those ideas. They stick to the model they had developed earlier, and as you saw in the previous slide, they produce pretty high quality education. So this is a sort of an overview of what's in each country chapter and how we try to understand them. That we have a kind of we are not saying that there is not the case that there is endogenous processes that work differently. So we are thinking that it is only about the spread of those ideas. It's very much what is interesting here is the interaction between those ideas and the local context. As always, ideas travel and context matters. So, Frank, will you take us?
Yeah. So, I want to highlight a couple of points that Björn just made. He went through the outcomes and that led us to choose these different countries. And, the countries, first and foremost, are examples of pretty serious privatization or public investment approaches.
Yeah.
And then the outcomes really give us a hint at what those approaches mean over time. And that's where this chart comes in. And just to note that Pasi Sahlberg came up with this term, the global education reform movement. He's the author of the Finnish chapter. And he talks about the germ as a set of policies that is exported and borrowed across countries. And those policies have very particular features that we'll get into in a second. But test-based accountability, standardization are among those different policies, and of course, a market orientation. And so what we've done is taken the germ metaphor to show that the germ can infect in certain places, and other places have different varieties of resistance or whatever to it. But eventually, it's likely that the germ or neoliberalism or what have you will come to play a part in an education decision-making process in your country. So that's why this book applies not only to the countries that are under discussion here, but has a global impact and reach. So moving along from this, we were talking about the findings aren't really about the outcomes, right? But we're trying to really articulate the trajectories. And when we look at what happened in Chile, as I mentioned, Milton Friedman helped Pinochet adopt this policy of privatization across sectors, from mining all the way to education. And in particular, this policy driver of privatization in education had an underpinning of choice. That was Milton Friedman's favorite rationale, economic rationale for why a consumer would have power in a marketplace, is that the consumer would have choice. And the mechanism that Chile chose to enact in particular, as we said, was vouchers. So parents get money from the government, and they can take that money and spend on any school that they choose, public or private. And in Chile's case, they can top up that money with their own additional family funding, which then creates inequity because each family can afford a little bit higher education than the other families, and then it creates a lot of stratification in between different social groups. So when we look at this chart, we can actually zoom out and just think about what would the key elements of these systems be in general, not just in Chile. And you have your policy drivers, your economic rationales, your education mechanisms, right? And what we find is that when we look at the neoliberal policy drivers, we have the kind of a list of orienting drivers that are occurring in different countries at different times, but they're generally along the same lines. So we have privatization, deregulation, decentralization, and liberalization. And in the book, we discuss these more in detail, but I just want to get it out there that this is how we're grouping these different strategies so that we can understand what's happening in the different countries. And then the economic rationale is often at play in these different, I'm just trying to get a video out of the way. We have the economic rationales of efficiency, choice, competition, and quality are often combined on an axis. Scarce resources, austerity are often used as a reason for implementing privatization or decentralization. And then equity is a contested term, as everybody wants to provide equity and claims that they're going to do that. But the real question, as we see from the outcomes, is do these systems actually provide equity? We'll return to that. So on the mechanism sides, how does this happen in these countries? We have vouchers, as in the case of Chile. The United States was originally pursuing vouchers, as Björn mentioned, in Milwaukee. But now, because of the issue of church and state and the separation of church and state, the charter model has really taken off as a source of a different feature or form of privatization in the U.S. market. And then Sweden marketized. And then what does that do in education? In particular, there's a standardization and test-based accountability, as I mentioned. Let's contrast these now with public investment approaches. And these really come from our cases. We looked at the cases. We looked at the different countries. What are they doing? They're in the general and the public investment countries, and these are less popular or well-known terms because there's been a lot of work in the last 30 years through the neoliberal approaches to really popularize the idea of choice and competition. But here we have public ownership, public responsibility. So public owns its education system. It's responsible for the education system. Equity is a high-level policy driver, not something that's discussed as an afterthought. And that people, communities, teachers, educators are involved in decisions around what happens to children in these countries.
Mm.
The economic rationales, turns out they have an economic basis, but they're not actually purely economic. It's more about, how do you get everybody educated, which has an economic benefit, but also personal benefits, cultural and social benefits as well. Preparing citizens, how do you have a well-prepared citizenry to participate in the democratic decisions of the policy drivers, and equity again. And then we look at how do they do that. I mean, if I were to say one thing from this study, the difference in the public investment model is that they prepare their teachers. Across the board, Cuba, Finland, and Ontario have invested heavily in their system, and in an education, that means you have good teachers. It means you give them support in pre-service and in service. And how do you do that? You have equitable funding. You can't just fund a subset of schools and teachers and expect the whole system to do well. And then what does that allow you to do? It allows you not to use the high stakes testing accountability to figure out who's doing what well or not well, but you depend on your teachers and the human resources that you've developed over time to implement a whole child curriculum and pedagogy that actually has a much broader reach than just math and language arts or the tested subjects, as is the case certainly in the United States. So those are basically the frameworks and the differences we pulled out from the different countries. And then here's a chart that kind of lays it out for each country. And each country is pursuing a lot of these different policies. But in the trying to make sense of it, we were able to pull out that there is a particular primary emphasis in each country that this chart captures. Chile, again, with the privatization choice vouchers move. And then the U.S. as privatization and choice, but really a charters are the mechanism. And then Sweden has really deregulated. They use competition between schools as their economic rationale, and their mechanism is really a market. It's not necessarily charter schools. It's the whole country really functions as an education marketplace. We look down at Cuba, public responsibility, universal and well-prepared teachers. And then Canada and Finland, you can read. So the whole point here is to really not only to capture what's going on across these different countries, but to highlight what's happening within them and use them maybe as roadmaps to find out, what other jurisdictions or countries are doing or what they could be doing to reach the kind of outcomes they want to get. So I think we're going to end the presentation with a couple of questions for our education community. So basically, how and why would these models benefit your community? How can education systems ensure equity in general? And then on a kind of an information level, how can we increase public understanding of how these different systems work? So with that, thank you very much.